Hi, in this video we're going to talk about the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia has different nuclei. So here is the striatum that will represent our striatum and is composed of caudate nucleus and putamen. So under it we'll draw another structure and this will represent our globus pallidus. The globus pallidus has two parts, externa and interna. And we draw another structure, is called the SubStantia nigra. It has one part where the neurons are compact together, pars compacta, and one part where the neurons are not so compact together, called reticularis. And here is the subthalamus. And these four are the basal nuclei, right? And if we draw another structure here, it will represent our cortex, and under the cortex we'll draw the thalamus. So the cortex and the thalamus, they are not the basal nuclei, but we need them for the direct and indirect pathways. So the direct pathway is stimulatory, so I write it in green, stimulatory. And the indirect pathway is inhibitory. So here you go, inhibitory. The direct pathway works like the accelerator in your body, and the indirect pathway is like the brakes. So what do I mean by this? I'll give you the example at the end of the video. So if we draw the direct pathway, and here you go, the neurons, they terminate in the striatum from the cortex. So these neurons in green are the glutaminergic neurons. They release the glutamate, and the glutamate is excitatory neurotransmitters, and these green dots will represent glutamate. And if we draw the red neurons, and they are GABAergic, and the GABAergic neurons, they will release the GABA, and the GABA is inhibitory neurotransmitter, and these red dots will represent GABA. We draw one more neurons, they are the blue ones, and the blue ones are dopaminergic neurons, and they release dopa. If they release dopa on D1 receptor, it will be stimulated, and if it's released on D2, it will be inhibited. So depending on the receptor they released on or work on, it will be different action. So when you are at rest and there is no glutamate release in the striatum, the GABAergic neurons will be not excited. When they're not excited, they send the fibers down to the globus pallidus interna, where they will not release the GABA. Decrease in the GABA here will release the globus pallidus interna neurons release of inhibition, and they will send the fibers in action potential and release the GABA in the thalamus. Increased GABA in the thalamus inhibits the thalamocortical neurons, and there will be no action performed, and when you're at rest, that's how the direct pathway works. Let's see what happens to the indirect pathway when you're at rest. The same glutaminergic neurons, no glutamate, and these GABAergic neurons will terminate in the externa, not like in the direct pathway. So they are put to sleep, means they're not excited. They will be drop in the GABA, and the neurons in the globus pallidus externa will be release of inhibition, and they will be excited. When they're excited, they send the fibers down to the subthalamus, and the subthalamus there will be increase in GABA. The release of GABA in subthalamus will inhibit the subthalamic nuclei, and they won't send the action potential up to the globus pallidus interna, where the neurons will be put to sleep, means they won't be excited, or they won't send the action potential to the thalamus. So that will result into the thalamic nuclei released of inhibition, right? Drop in the GABA, the thalamic nuclei will be released of inhibition, they will be excited. When they're excited, they will send the action potential to the cortex. In the cortex, stimulating group of neurons that send the fibers down to the spinal cord and stimulating some muscles, right? So here you go. These neurons will fire and they will stimulate a group of muscles. So what happens when you intend to do an activity? This was at rest. Now let's see when you want to do an action. And let's say the action potential from the cortex you intend to do activity, there is release of neurotransmitters, and that stimulate the direct pathway, and the direct pathway will fire down to the striatum, sending action potential to release the glutamate, and the glutamate there will stimulate or wake these neurons up. Now these neurons will send the action potential down to the globus pallidus interna, where they will release the GABA, and the GABA will inhibit these neurons in the globus pallidus interna. And when these neurons are inhibited, there will be no action potential going to release the GABA in the thalamus. That means drop in the GABA in the thalamus. And these neurons released off inhibition, and they will fire, and the action potential will go up to the cortex and release the glutamate in the cortex. The glutamate will stimulate a group of neurons in the cortex, and that will send the fibers to the muscles as well. Now, we will come back to that. So let's see what happens at the indirect pathway. So the indirect pathway, when stimulated, send the action potential down to the striatum, the same glutaminergic system, and the glutamate release on these neurons, and they will be excited. And these are GABAergic neurons. When they wake up, they send the action potential to the globus pallidus externa, that results into increase in the GABA. The increased GABA will inhibit these neurons, and there will be no action potential going down to the subthalamus. They will be put to sleep, means they will be not excited. So they will be dropped in the GABA in the subthalamus, and these neurons will be released of inhibition. When they're released of inhibition, they will be excited and send the action potential to the globus pallidus interna. And these neurons will be excited, and they will wake up. When they wake up, they send the action potential to the thalamus, that results into increase in the GABA, and the increased GABA will inhibit these neurons. And then the muscles that were activated at rest will be relaxed or inhibited now, right? So the direct pathway will stimulate a group of muscles that are agonist muscles to make you do the action, and the antagonist muscle has to be inhibited, so it will let you do the action, right? That's how the direct and indirect pathway work. One has to, like the flexor, if you want to flex, the extensor has to relax. So if the extensor contracts and the flexor contract, it won't work like this. So what is the function of the dopaminergic system in this? When the dopaminergic neurons in the striatum release the dopamine, and the dopamine on a direct pathway, it's D1 receptor, so it will stimulate. When they stimulate the direct pathway, it helps you to initiate the movement. So the dopaminergic system helps you to initiate the movement. Now, here is a diagram other than the other one. So here is the dopa on the D1, and it helps you to do the action, initiate the movement, okay? So on the agonist muscle, let's imagine. And there is on D2 receptor, on the indirect pathway, it inhibits. And the end result is still stimulatory, means the antagonist muscle, they work. When you want to terminate the activity, you need the antagonist to contract, right? Let's say here is the indirect pathway, and here is the dopa release on the indirect pathway, and it's inhibitory, so it inhibits these neurons in the globus pallidus externa, right? So these neurons will go to the subthalamus. In the subthalamus, there will be increase of GABA, and the increased GABA will inhibit the subthalamic nuclei, and this will lead to those neurons in the globus pallidus interna put to sleep, means they are not excited by the glutamate release. So there will be drop in the GABA in the thalamus, and that will result into a thalamic nuclei excitation and then action potential to the cortex. That will result into the glutamate release, and then these neurons will send the fiber to the muscles, and the antagonist muscle will contract to help you terminate the action. So let's get back to our diagram here, and here is your dopa. It inhibits the indirect pathway, and drop in the GABA will release these neurons of inhibition, and they will fire into the subthalamus. In the subthalamus, they will inhibit these neurons, and those neurons in the globus pallidus interna will be put to sleep. Means no action potential going to the thalamus. In the thalamus, the neurons will be released of inhibition because the GABA will drop there. And when they are released of inhibition, they will fire into the cortex to release the glutamate. And that glutamate, increased glutamate, will stimulate neurons that will make your antagonist to contract so you can terminate the activity that you don't want anymore. That's how the direct and indirect pathways are influenced by the dopaminergic system. So if we go back to our diagram here, there is an example. Why did I call the direct pathways the accelerator? Let's imagine the dopa is the driver and you are the vehicle, right? So here is the dopa is the driver, and the direct pathways, and this is you, right? The vehicle is you, and the direct pathway is the accelerator. And the indirect pathways are the brakes. Now, when there is no driver, can you have accelerator? No. When there is no driver, can you have brakes to whatever you're doing? No. So the dopa helps you accelerate, means the dopa helps you initiate the movement. And then it's the dopa working on the indirect pathway helps you quit that unwanted movement, right? So this is how the dopaminergic system influence direct and indirect pathways. So if there is a degeneration to the dopaminergic system, like in Parkinson's disease, what happens? The person in Parkinson's disease with low dopamine have problems initiating the movement. So that's why I call it accelerator, right? So when they initiate the movement, they have problem stopping that movement. Sometimes they fall or they cannot turn around very fast, like they can't take the U-turn or whatever you call it. So that's why the dopaminergic systems are working like the driver in your body, and you're the vehicle, and the direct pathways accelerator and the indirect pathways brakes. So here's one more system, the cholinergic system. The cholinergic system works opposite to the dopaminergic system. The dopa stimulates the direct pathway, and this one inhibits the direct pathway. The dopa inhibits the indirect pathway, and this one stimulates the indirect pathway. So this is how the acetylcholine works against it.